The Collector is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting characters to come out of Disney TVA history, and whether or not that's a sentiment you agree with, I think it's safe to say that his slow build-up and rise to prominence in Season 2, before gaining a physical form in its finale and Season 3, has been a captivating journey for all of us Owl House fans. And speaking of this journey, when you go back and rewatch the few moments we had with him in Season 2 when he was still in his shadow form, he sort of feels like a different person. Sure, they both share constant traits of being playful, immature, and all around silly, but the different ways in which these key traits are tacked onto a wider exhibition and perception of character is a topic that compels me. Because where our current Collector feels simply like a misguided little kid, his earlier depictions lean towards a more sadistic individual, and was received by audiences as a rather sinister character. So my goal today is to try and debunk and analyze exactly how and why these two versions of the same person can feel different. Before I start off, I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer that this is my first cartoon analysis video, and I am by no means an expert. My only qualification is being a current high school film student, so take these interpretations however you will. These are just my own original thoughts and a product of my fascination with this character. Agree or disagree, you are absolutely free to form your own opinion. That being said, let's get into the question at hand. Of course, design-wise, the distinction is clear. The image of a shadowy figure with striking eyes is a common and timeless means of visually depicting villains within animated works, making an instinctive association with the sinister. What's more, his dynamic form and ability to shapeshift as a shadow allows him to appear larger than life. Not only can he appear taller and bigger than he actually is, he can engulf entire surfaces, and he has the ability to duplicate himself in a multitude of shapes, which can be used to swarm around the person he talks to, and this can feel rather overwhelming. This naturally makes him seem more physically threatening, menacing, and unpredictable. This dynamic form, combined with the initial assumption that this tall, ominous huntsman was the Collector in his true form, added to a perception of a more sadistic and maniacal entity. Now, these are all just pretty basic observations, and originally I was just going to skim over the element of design because, well, it's so obvious. Just comparing these two designs side by side, it's not that hard to distinguish a difference. It basically answers its own question. But the more I thought in depth about this design, the more I started to gain an appreciation for what it represents. Because in my understanding, or rather overthinking, of the matter, this shadow design symbolizes a lot more to the Collector than just aesthetic value. When considering their overall differences between design and behavior, a key aspect of explanation is the narrative that Bellows was using the Collector throughout the entirety of Season 2, up until the midpoint of King's Tide, that is. And in light of this fact, everything makes more sense. Consider this Collector as having been reduced to a shadow. Consider the shapes they make and how they can be used as an extension of narration. This menacing shape-shifting form can be interpreted as alluding to the likeness of shadow puppets, which are manipulated through the light to be bent to the puppeteer's will, to see its intended shape and story come to life. And in this case, the Collector is being used like a puppet for Bellows, exploited for the brilliance of his power, and in the meantime, manipulated and dragged along in accordance to the shape of his plans. The Collector, without his powers or physical form, is only a shadow, cloaked in the dark, unnoticed, and just a vague image of what he once was. If Bellows is he who holds up the light to a wall, he who lets the Collector be seen after years and years of solitude and darkness, then he is who the Collector graciously performs for, and Bellows can orchestrate whatever show he wants with his willing puppet.
I just need to live long enough to see this through. And you're going to help me, Collector.
But design is only the package a character comes wrapped in, and it is only one half of this argument. In my rewatching of Season 2, the Collector's difference in behavior stuck out to me as pretty jarring. Like I said, his childish and playful nature was a constant, of course, but when he was riddling about the Day of Unity's darkness, treating Grimwalkers insensitively, and delivering snide taunts really frequently, it did paint him in a more malicious light. It was easier to believe that this was just some really immature villain, not unlike the kinds we've seen before in sinister characters like Bill Cipher per se. But flash forward to our latest episode with the Collector in For the Future, and suddenly he's curled up cozy in his little bed, asking for bedtime stories and pizza bagels, and completely, sincerely naive to all of the faults of his actions. And the contrasts between these two versions of the Collector, so much so that they at times don't even feel like the same kid, makes sense when you consider their difference in a best friend, as well as the type of game that's been presented to them. The Collector is someone who, in my opinion, has no distinguished or stable sense of personal identity. I want to make a video explaining that notion on its own someday, but for now, what's important to derive from this is that his only goals, being for games and friendship, are vague, flexible, and simple, and he will gladly act in accordance to whoever is promising him any kind of ability to play and have company. It's also worth noting that the Collector is seemingly very loyal to whoever promises to be his best friend, and is more than willing to abide by their wishes, not exactly having a stable moral compass of his own. So, when he only had Bellows as a source of company for hundreds of years, naturally he'd play to Bellows' likeness, mimicking his sadistic behavior and playing off of the fact that Bellows aims for destruction and villainy in order to appeal to his goodwill and maintain their quote-unquote friendship. Considering that we now know the Collector doesn't normally wish for violence and holds no real malice towards Witchkind or even Titans, it proves his behavior in Hollow Mind to be that much more ingenuine.
Betrayed, beguiled, alone, deceived! We'll have our revenge on... Unity is so hard to rhyme.
He notably says we, despite the story revealing that he had no personal motives for seeking revenge for himself at the time. It shows how he frames Bellows' revenge as a motive for himself too, like I said, because he seeks Bellows' good graces and maybe even validation. This isn't actually something he wants. Bellows could have asked for literally anything else, destructive or not, and he would have played along too. I see his inability to rhyme unity also as a representation that his heart isn't actually in the matter. And what's more, unity isn't that hard to rhyme, but unity is exactly what is lacking in the relationship between him and Bellows, because he himself is unknowingly being
betrayed, beguiled, alone, deceived!
The Collector is so desperate for company that he lets the signs of Bellows' lies pass him by, convincing himself that his only friend is mutually looking out for his interests, and in the meantime reciprocates Bellows' twisted nature, to pretend like they have common goals, common traits, anything that can constitute of a real connection between them. Additionally, I'd like to point out that Bellows' position as the adult in the situation also makes the Collector more liable to these habits. Regardless of how the Collector may coin him as a friend, it doesn't change the fact that, as a more grown-up individual, there is an instinctive dynamic of influence and control. And alike how a little kid may copy the behaviors of their older sibling or parent, well, there's another explanation for you. I also see the Collector's repeated taunting about Grimwalkers as overcompensation for such fears of his. Sure, he has no concept of mortality and the value of life, so he probably doesn't register each new Grimwalker as proper individuals to begin with. But he does understand concepts of loyalty and betrayal. He's seen how Bellows is quick to take advantage of others like Hunter, and how time and time again he's ruthlessly backstabbed them. And these are people who were as good as loyal children like himself. So he repeatedly makes fun of the Grimwalkers, playing it off as if he's not afraid of such a fate, because that couldn't possibly happen to him too, right? These remarks can therefore be read as overcompensation, as an attempt to remove himself from the very possibility of such a fate by placing himself in a position of power and importance above Grimwalkers in the eyes of Bellows, as if he has an equal part to play in that orchestration. He thinks if he makes jest of Bellows' despicable actions, it will make him immune to them, because, after all, they're supposed to be friends and equals, right? Well, in Season 2, before meeting King and achieving his iconic physical form, we get 2 instances of this false, twisted persona slipping, and the scared, desperate kid that's actually there feels a lot more like the one we know now.
I won't be alone. I won't be alone anymore.
Hello? Hello?
Who said that? Who's there?
What?
Wait, don't leave! Come back! He's my friend, right?
What?
He wouldn't lie. He wouldn't.
Who is that?
He wouldn't.
Hello?
We spent hundreds of years playing his game. I want to play a new game. But you said you'd let me out. I hate it here.
Just a little longer.
The fear in his voice, the sheer desperation to just not be alone. I personally believe that he has the natural tendency to cling to others in general. But of course, when you think about that horrible, crippling loneliness, being a child left alone for so long, you would do just about anything, say absolutely anything, just to feel some form of a connection too, wouldn't you? And what's more, Bellows said it was a game, didn't he? Even if it's not one that he chose, at least it's something to play. How could he doubt Bellows when technically he is getting a scrap of what he wants too? So he'll faithfully play along and adopt the role that this game calls for in the meantime, because certainly if he plays real nice, then he's being a good friend and can have his turn too, right? But then Bellows betrays him, and all of these little doubts and insecurities about their relationship are all but proven. And he doesn't play the demeanor of this cocky, malicious jester anymore. Instead, we see a hurt and rightfully upset child, who's unfortunately yet another victim of Bellows' backstabbing. And furthermore, it becomes clear to us that he wasn't, in fact, in it for the bloodshed. He didn't actually mean it in a metaphorical or devious way when he said that he wanted to play games. He really is just a little kid. And this notion is extended upon when he meets King, who's a kid himself, and a good one at that. And this newfound dynamic is empowering for the collector, not just because King could physically set him free, but because it allows him to completely embrace his childish nature in the company of another child.
You need to have more faith in pinky swears. But you said we were friends. We pinky swore. You lied.
I would never pinky swear.
You promise?
You can trust me, Collector.
And henceforth, he doesn't appear to be concerned with malicious destruction anymore, aside from his swift attack on Bellows, which honestly is warranted. But this final cold act of sadism, warranted or not, combined with his astonishing display of power, as well as the mysterious cliffhanger of what the Owl House game was going to be, all left the collector within more questionable and wary grounds at the end of the Season 2 finale. So it's no wonder at this point that the fandom was seemingly conflicted on whether or not he was redeemable. But after getting more time with him in For the Future, well, let's get into that. Like I mentioned earlier, analyzing the question of how and why this and this seem different can be split into sanctions of design and behavior. So let's apply this to the physical collector now. Design-wise, the distinction is once again clear. This version of the collector lacks the harsh angular shapes that Shadow Collector had, creating a more soft and friendly appearance. Shape theory and all that junk. The ominous and foreboding nature of design is all but removed in the inclusion of bright, soft colors. Sharp and mischievous eyes are now replaced with more ordinary ones, yellow and red, not unlike King's own eye colors. This new form also lacks that intimidating ability to morph along surfaces in varied size and shape, trading it instead for the habit of floating. Of course, this can be intimidating in its own right, but it doesn't create an illusion of larger scale that his shadow form does, and it prevents us as the audience from doubting his existence as a small child. And of course, it becomes aware to us that this terrifying huntsman from the Owl Dream was not in fact our collector, which is already a sigh of relief. To put it simply, his physical form is in tune with his character as a silly child, allowing us as the audience to predominantly perceive and understand that side of him. I mean, look at that soft fluffy hair, the little freckles on his soft little cheeks, that sweet smile. Does that look like a sinister creature to you? But of course, as is the case with Shadow Collector, deeper meaning beyond aesthetic value can be derived from this design. At a first glance, the clothing of the collector is obviously read as an emphasis of his childlike nature. The oversized sleeves accentuate his small stature, and the patterns and split color scheme complement his skin, as well as his role as a collector. But I read this as symbolic of his character as well, and in line with my point regarding his lack of stable and distinguished identity. Let's zoom out for a second. Sure, we haven't seen the other collectors in proper action, but in these portraits of them, you can see that they dwarf him astronomically in their size, and also that their style of clothing is similar to his own, except on them, it looks more formal and carries the appropriate air of mystique and grandeur that you'd expect from such omnipresent beings. Our collector's iteration of this attire, on the other hand, looks whimsical at best. It isn't so much as cloak-like as it does resemble pajamas. It is clear that his own version of this attire attempts to cater to his status as the child of the fleet. It represents the attempts at combining his childish nature and desires with that of the collector's species and role. But the attire is still oversized on him, not just because he's physically small, but because symbolically, that oversized attire symbolizes how he can never be a cold, ruthless collector like the rest of his kind, and vice versa. It represents how he can never fill a position as a harmless, normal child, so long as he brandishes the power and status of a collector. It's the same way he wants to have a proper bedtime story, and is instead subjected to this thing. The key takeaway from this is that even though the collector tries, he just can't be a normal child, much less have a normal friendship with another child. Extending on that notion, let's get into his behavior and what influence King and the Owl House game has over it. King obviously doesn't look to manipulate the collector like Bellows had, because 1, he's a good person, and 2, he is afraid of upsetting him. And like I said, he is also a kid, and naturally, these aspects make the collector feel less pressured into pretending to be big and menacing and reciprocating malicious energy that he just doesn't hold. Sure, he's indifferent to the fragility of mortals and will transform others into puppets if they cross him, but the mean-spirited taunting and devious behavior just completely disappears. To put the relationship dynamic on his end simply, around Bellows he acts more like a knowing bully and feels like he has to display this by taking a few jabs at the guy himself. Around King, he acts like a happy-go-lucky child and doesn't feel ashamed to show his rather clingy and overprotective sides too. And of course, his relationship with King is far, far more positive and healthy than it ever was with Bellows. King is a sweetheart, and even though his initial friendship with the collector was forged upon somewhat of an ulterior motive, it is very clear that King does care about the collector. But that doesn't mean that the collector is free from the pressures of putting on facades. Being in the presence of a fellow kid is freeing in its regard, of course, but like I said, it doesn't take away the collector's inherent status as more than just an ordinary kid, something that he clearly does not comprehend, and hence he cannot relate to or fully understand King. There is still a gap of separation that internally confuses him, and perhaps makes him feel a little insecure. Like I said, for Bellows, in the sake of the twisted and dark actions that were proposed as a game to him, he felt even more of a need to play the part of a big bad right-hand man, in hopes of fulfilling a real spot by Bellows' side. With King, the nature of actions at hand are pretty much inverted, but are still framed as a game for the collector. A game that centers around the very act of playing pretend. And in the end, whether or not King intends for it to happen, this inevitably perpetuates a pressure for the collector to play a role that isn't his, to pretend like he knows the situations of a life that he never experienced. Because, well, it means so much to King. Surely, if he plays the part of important people in King's life, then it'll bridge that area of disconnect that he can't relate to, and he'll get to fulfill a spot of his own in his best friend's heart, right?
It looked like they were playing a game. Yeah, with some kind of messed up version of my life. King must have told him about our adventures.
Once again, there is an element of overcompensation for his insecurities. Sure, it doesn't loom as large over his head. King actually and kindly reciprocates care for the collector. But when it's very obvious that King doesn't hold him as close as he does with someone like Luce, that desperation, again born out of being left alone for so long, will of course drip into his actions and behavior. The bottom line is that the collector, whether the mask he wears is of a villain or a hero, only absorbs the situation around him. Hence why I said earlier that he doesn't have any distinguished or stable identity. Like a parrot repeating back its owner's words, like the moon which reflects the light of the sun rather than emitting that of its own, the collector at every step of the way lacks the agency of making choices that are truly and fully of his own. The only thing he himself has ever really wanted, without influence from somebody else, was for friendship and to play games. But are any of these games ever his choice?
There are so many games I want to play. Now you can set me free and we can play new games. Hey, do you like hide and seek? I'll hide first. We've been playing pretend forever, King. It is fun, but what if we switch it up?
No, not really. And isn't it kind of sad that in all of the games he proposes and looks forward to, the only ones he's ever really been allowed were just created out of other people's deeper motivations, whether or not they were for good or for evil? So, with all of that said, I think we have thoroughly laid out an answer to the question of how and why these versions of the collector seem so different. But after pouring a lot of effort into this essay, I found myself asking, so what? What's the point? Because even still, through all of this, through all the variations we've analyzed, the collector at his core remains stagnant. I phrased my question the way I did because it's true. He only ever feels different. The collector still has a long way to go to reach substantial character development because at the end of the day, these are all just fluctuations. And while it certainly is a foundation towards the path of redemption and development, it isn't necessarily growth of any kind. The collector is a quote-unquote child of the stars. Stars can be read as a symbol of hope, and like real children, the collector's person is untapped potential, resting on the brink of something greater to grow into. But he has been stuck as a child for hundreds of years, which is a narrative that hyperbolizes that unachieved growth within him. The hope that he will come into his own and learn his mistakes are very much there, but for now, it only remains as hope, because he hasn't reached the point of a revelation. His access to power has come in ups and downs over the course of the series. He's felt hurt and he's felt happy. He's been surrounded by a cast of different people throughout his existence. But he himself hasn't learned anything to facilitate a significant and productive change. These ups and downs have merely allowed a shift of the audience's perspective of him, revealing the nuanced sides of his existing psyche, like a moon cycle of sorts. The perceived shape of the moon can change depending on what stage of the cycle it's in, but the moon itself stays in the same form nonetheless. For him to take this next step towards true and real inner development, to step into a path, whether it is of light or darkness, it needs to be driven not by false pretenses or the will of others, but of his own conscious decision. Only then can the collector truly invent his very own developed and defined identity, rather than one that has been collected. I love studying characters, and the Owl House is just an absolute candy store of opportunities to do so. The collector speaks to me in particular, and as one of my favorite characters ever, my spiritual son, and my current hyperfixation, I have done a lot of analysis on them in particular. In the future, if I'm lucky enough to have the time, I would, like I brought up many times in this essay, love to do a more in-depth video study of his character, because I have so many more thoughts. So if I do manage to make and upload that video, I hope to see you all then. But if not, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I have provided some meaningful interpretation and analysis on the psyche of everyone's favorite little star child. Like I mentioned, this is my first cartoon analysis video ever, and it's something I've always wanted to do, and I am very excited about it. So leave a like and let me know if you'd be interested to see more from me, and subscribe for more silly cartoon-centered content. Thank you so much for tuning in, and good night.